Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a treat today. Why? Because I'm in for a treat today as we have Justin Rootnerine. I hope I got that right. To join us today, Justin, first of all, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
Thank you. This is a great experience. Thank you.
So, you really have an interesting background. You're a podcaster, which makes you double gold star in my eyes. And could you start off by telling our listeners your professional background?
Of course. So, my professional background spanned both the private and public sector. Long story short, I started off as an engineer. I'd like to think of myself as an engineer by trade, just someone who solves problems. Joined the Air Force as a 62 Echo or developmental engineer, basically an aerospace software engineer. Since then, my career has kind of spanned various engineering disciplines from financial engineering, software, I like solving problems and understanding complex systems. So in a nutshell, that's what my career's revolved around.
And tell us about your podcast.
Of course. So not to shill too much, but it's the Approaching Affinity Show. It aims to be a podcast at the intersection of all things finance, innovation, technology, and just like bringing on interesting guests to talk about the things in that realm, how we can add value to the listeners, new insights, and just kind of refining our crafts.
So this podcast, or your recording rather, will go up on a podcast called Innovation and Compliance. And although the word compliance is in the title, it's really about innovation. And that's what intrigued me so much and why I wanted to have you come on a pod. But more importantly, I like to have people who are not directly in compliance. So you can give your ideas to the compliance profession and maybe we can learn something from it. Or as I say, have your people talk to my people. So with that, can you explain your thoughts on really why checklist compliance is completely insufficient, or flipping it, why compliance needs to be beyond simply a checklist?
All right. So I guess we could take this from a few different perspectives as well. So let's take the current case, right? If compliance was a checklist, right? You just, or SOP or standard operating procedure, I don't know, make sure nothing's out of bounds, make sure, nobody's fraudulent compliant, just generic things like that. But those are at the end of the day broad, and they don't cover complex systems, both in the military for mission assurance needs, both in the financial world for, systems are always changing, evolving, etc. So if you were to just have a standard checklist, I would say it's a good, maybe a starting point. Right? You're going to refine these over time, but it's never going to be the all-encompassing solution. Your checklist, so to say, for lack of better words, is always going to be evolving. And as the needs of your fund, your mission, your workload change, that compliance checklist is going to have to evolve as well. Does that answer your question, or we want to dive into any one particular?
Let me see if I can translate that into compliance speak. As your risks change, you need to identify those risks. You need to put in an evolving risk management strategy. You need to train your employees, customers, third parties on that strategy, implement it, monitor, and then improve as appropriate. Would that be anything close to what you said?
Hit the nail on the head. So with an example, let's go with the financial world, right? I'm a big fan of when you're solving problems and you arrive at a solution, or at least when you're at least hypothesizing, you should be able to write down the steps or at least thought process you had to come to that point. Same with compliance and risk, right? If we have a hard rule, hey, our portfolio, we aim our best efforts to have not a drawdown of X percentage, right? Hey, this is exactly how we do it. Monitor these positions, make sure you're watching these metrics. If you see a ball spike of this, you're monitoring this, and you put in algorithmic or programmatic checks to do that. Now, you're compliant with your internal fund policies, and you've done it in a programmatic, documented way. And if something breaks, hey, you can see exactly where in the process it broke and fix it.
So I am a lawyer by professional background and obviously look at things very differently than you do, having had an engineering father and having some understanding of how you all look at problems as opposed to lawyers. And one of the things that I think you advocate is that compliance needs to be a process, and that process needs to be documented. And many lawyers don't think like that. If you were going to sit down with a lawyer or a chief compliance officer, how would you help them understand the process component of what you've described, but also the documentation and why it needs to be documented for continuous improvement down the road?
Right. So let's take the counter example, right? If this wasn't documented, if we didn't have, I know we just made the point where we don't want to make a checklist, a generic checklist, but you should be able to have a loose process as to what you're evaluating against. What is compliant? What does compliant look like? If that was our goal, Let's define it. And then let's actually make those written procedures and processes, make them algorithmically. I realize not everything can be programmatically implemented, but it's a great starting point. If you're unable to say, okay, let's maybe take a portfolio, I guess, you have a certain amount of exposure, right? You don't want to overexpose. You don't want to be underexposed. Those are numbers. Those are constraints. Now, there's various different ways to address overexposure or underexposure. What's the best way to pick that, right? Hey, this is what we did in the past. You can draw from historical data. You can draw from what previous traders or market conditions or dynamics allow for. But the idea is the same, right? The problem you're trying to address is your exposure. The process is how exactly you do that. Now, there is a right process. And of course, there's several different wrong ways to do that. If you were just kind of willy-nilly, okay, I think we'll, cut here, add here, not looking at any standardized process, and you're kind of just shooting in the dark. All right. At the end of the day, how I guess we define compliance here is, of course, compliance with all the applicable rules, regulations, but also compliance with your internal firm rules, right? That process you follow, albeit dynamic, can be implemented programmatically, can be adaptable, and rules and limits are adjusted as needed. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. My particular variety of compliance is anti-corruption compliance, so bribery, corruption, things like that. And it also includes money laundering, so AML, and now it's expanded out to trade sanctions and export control. So basically issues a corporation needs to deal with. One of the things that has occurred, certainly in 2026, that surprised me is in the sort of anti-corruption, anti-money laundering world, and even export control, we've had companies that were on as highly a sanctioned list, bad guy list, high risk list as you could be on, now become open. So we had in February or earlier this year, Venezuela, which was heavily sanctioned up until the time Maduro was removed. Then we had the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has been beset by those types of problems. But a new regime has actually made it more possible or more attractive to do business because of a rule of law. And this week, we now have Iran, which I didn't think we'd ever get a non-sanctioned Iran, at least in my lifetime. But the point is, I've seen things change where things become more risky and you have to put more risk management strategies in place. But here, if they're not less risky, they're at least open that you could consider doing business in those. How do you think through a situation where something was simply too risky, whether it was an engineering problem, whether it was a financial problem or other problem, but because of geopolitical changes or really any changes, weather changes, geopolitical, any other change, it becomes at least possible to have the conversation if you can put the right risk management strategy in place.
All right. Now, I'll preface this, not legal advice for any means, but I would always seek something like that, seek legal counsel. That's my cop out, is you're talking about, on one side of the coin, right? From the, hey, is there an opportunity there? Right? If trade or relations with Venezuela and Iran or other formerly adversarial nations ends up smoothing over to a certain extent, and you're the first player in the market, maybe there's a golden opportunity there that a lot of other guys are just too afraid to touch. But that's the key word, afraid to touch. Why? Navigating that landscape is going to be tricky. So I hate to just go back to the generic risk reward, bias. But here in the situations, like I said, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have, I would seek legal counsel there because I don't understand the risk. Sure, there might be huge rewards, but, if you're not understanding the risk, if you are interacting with a sanctioned entity or, you're non-compliant in some way, which I think dancing around those, just the more and more I think about it, would you ever go about it on your own? Sure. Maybe you can see, all right, maybe, this, I believe it's like Shell or BP or Exxon are now operating in Venezuela. Would you want to do some direct participation there? Okay, maybe there's an opportunity, right? Maybe there's a true untapped potential, but how would you navigate that landscape? Can you just trust that maybe Shell or Exxon are navigating it appropriately by you investing, you're fine? I wouldn't make that assumption. So as much as one would want to go after the opportunity, You never want to pursue unknown risks. And one of those big risks is compliance. And if something I don't understand, I'm not going to go after.
So one of the things I have always tried to advocate is that FARs, or Federal Acquisition Regulation, actually could be the key to creating a competitive advantage. And if you can navigate FARs or even just play within the rules, it actually may give you a leg up on some of your competitors. So I wanted to turn to FARs and ask you what your thoughts around that topic are.
Of course. So the FAR, like the Federal Acquisition Regulations, are, bottom line up front, they're the rule book for how U.S. agencies basically buy their goods and services. Now you're right. Hey, if I, like, say in layman terms, interpret the FAR, I can now do business with adversarial nation, or formerly adversarial nation X or company X, and hey, there's this FAR clause that says so. Sure, but it's truly that interpretation, right? The FAR is a massive document, and it is, so to say, our North Star for all things USG or U.S. government procurement, so to say. Now, I hate to keep using the same cop-out answer on you, but it is a massive, complex document for a reason that should not be treated lightly and needs legal interpretation, right? Now, to your question, right, could it be modified in a way such that it points the guidelines for interacting with sanctioned entities companies? Is it that North Star? I would argue yes, but for the problem it solves, does it solve the problem for lawyers, or does it solve the problem for, so to say, me in layman terms? Do I now clearly understand, hey, can I do business with sanctioned company X or formerly sanctioned company X? I would probably still seek legal counsel on that. Yeah, I hate to keep giving you these cop-out answers.
So I lived in Houston for a long time, and it wouldn't surprise you that I worked in the energy space there, because a large part of the legal work was for energy companies in a variety of roles. But there's a large part of compliance that is in what we call regulated industries. So banking, financial services, financial advisors, investment advisors, financial services, all are heavily regulated. So they get the moniker regulated industries. But I wanted to maybe ask you, what lessons from government contracting apply to regulated industries in your opinion?
What types of regulations apply to those types of contracts?
Or what lessons from government contracting could you say apply?
Yeah, all government contracting is determined by the applicable FAR clauses, right? That's mostly the entire FAR, whether it's how you can determine your profit, what the type of contract is, who can bid on it, clean and clear, right? If you're bidding a solution, on some cases, there might be a clause where, hey, no non-U.S. citizens on this contract. And if you violate that, your bid, your proposal, your contract is in jeopardy. So it's still a North Star, and it's still, of utmost importance, whether you're, so to say, an entity trying to take advantage, or a financial firm or bank or whatnot, or if you're just your first time, so to say, bidding on one of these government contracts. Understanding of the FAR and the DFARs and all the other respective regulations are key, because one small mistake can be, honestly, give you quite the headache.
So let me turn to something called Algorithmic Auditor. And could you explain what that is, and how would you explain that to a client or potential client?
It kind of goes back to that earlier process, right? If you were able to programmatically set guidelines, limits, do not exceed, do not go below, I hate to, say the use of AI, but AI at least helps you get a certain interpretation and understanding in certain ways. So algorithmic auditing, remove the algorithm. What is an audit? End of the day, do your numbers check out? Does your logic check out? Are you compliant with regulation X or internal fund rules? Or, in the case of, so to say, mission assurance, are you compliant? Hey, can you assure U.S. access to space? Are you abiding by your mission? Those can be auditable to a certain extent. Algorithmically can help you speed up the process, make it programmatic, true false conditions to kind of bring the programmatic element into it. Combining those two things is powerful. I'd argue a lot of auditing is already algorithmic. Kind of going further in that space, especially with the advent of AI, or not advent, but heyday of LLMs and respective technologies like that, there's a lot more room to increase the efficiency of these algorithmic audits, so to say, make them better, more efficient, helpful for the client, customer, and honestly, entities that are putting out these regulations. What do you think?
So the I guess I want to see how can we either wed or pair this concept with human oversight. And in AI, it's called the human in the loop. But my sense is that good technology does not replace judgment. It just strengthens it or gives you the ability to look at a wider set of numbers to find anomalies if you can set a high and a low that you want to set as your parameters.
Somewhat, right? I mean, let's take both points of the argument. Is there a world where you could just algorithmically audit an entire, so to say, hey, are you compliant with this contract? Go clause by clause by clause. If it is a bunch of numeric values and you have numeric data, sure, maybe you can get a 95% solution because you're just comparing numbers. But when things get arbitrary, right, that's when I guess it actually becomes difficult. I don't have a good answer there, right? Could you algorithmically audit, to what degree of confidence? Hey, are you, if it's a dynamic system, so to say, not just numbers, but, what's the right term here? Not numerical data, but open to interpretation, I guess. That's where things get a little bit fuzzy. And that's where, you would need your legal counsel. All that to say, algorithmic auditing, right, would most likely have its place. It's most likely going to be a much evolving field. In simple audits where it's just numerical data or just easy comparisons or whatnot, of course, you're able to speed up your speed of audits and quickly, you're not wasting your auditor's time. So to say, they don't have to, go through numerous amounts of paper. They can kind of speed it up. They're still going to have to do it, but it helps with their process efficiency for more complex things. It could help understanding, all right, here are these more open to interpretation clauses, right? How can we make gates? How can we make checks when you're doing through this audit that when an auditor is reviewing the materials, what do I look for? Right. Before I have to look through every single doc, kind of make a, to the best of my knowledge, determination. But now algorithmically, if you're able to put conditions in place, you can kind of see, all right, maybe you're breaching this threshold by this percentage. Maybe you should look here. It would assist you. So to your point, yeah, you're always going to need the person, but it's about making the job faster, making it more efficient, and actually making the audit a true audit.
I'd like to turn to an issue I don't think I've had the chance to explore with anyone, so I was really intrigued to visit with you, which is military leadership inside the C-suite. I want to preface it with the following. In the 60s and 70s, when I was growing up, my father, who served in World War II in Korea, was in his 40s and 50s. And he and many of his colleagues were becoming of an age where they, moved from middle management up to the C-suite and then continued that rise. And then obviously we had Vietnam and other periods leading up to the first Gulf War and then the second Gulf War and then the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And starting after 9/11, we had sort of a new generation go into the military in numbers greater than they had done previously, at least maybe for the past 20 or 30 years. And now many of those people are in their 40s. And some of the people who went in early into Iraq are in their mid 40s now, and they'll be moving into their 50s, but they're in leadership positions in their organizations now. So I'm seeing a kind of a new cycle of people trained in military style leadership, command and control, moving into positions of leadership in business now. And so I wanted to use that as an introduction to ask you as military officer. I'm not sure if you're retired or not, so I won't just make that assumption. But as a military officer, what are some of the principles that you think really from the military can make a business run more efficiently and better? And at the end of the day, more profitably?
Understood. Yeah. So, there's numerous lessons, right? And then to answer your question, yeah, if I'm an Air Force officer, separated for right now, but key lessons that I learned in the military that apply to business later on. Overarching kind of from this discussion, the military kind of teaches you that ambiguity is honestly normal in some cases, right? You're not always going to have defined exit criteria, defined goals, but the job, your role is to create enough structure to act regardlessly. You still have to, to the best of your knowledge, do your job in ambiguous environments with ambiguous goals. Now, how that translates to a business environment, you're going to have to still take risks. I realize this discussion is about compliance, understanding, how to hedge your bets, so to say. But you're never going to have all the answers. You're never going to have the complete process that determines, hey, this is a completely compliant process. It's always going to be evolving. We have to be able to learn, adapt, act. in ambiguous environments to kind of get after your goal while being compliant. And it's easier said than done. And admittedly, we're all still probably going to learning that. And it's going to be a lifelong learning journey. I mean, speed and discipline aren't opposites, right? But good systems make our disciplined actions better in these ambiguous environments.
We focus on information, and I certainly understand information flowing down. As I said, my father, well, he was a naval officer, so we had very much command household. And information was given from the top and it worked its way down. It didn't go really the other way, though. So I've always wondered, how does a military officer or retired military officer who moves into business, how have you learned to get the information up from the lower ranks so that you can make those decisions?
It all goes back to the process, admittedly. If the military is a very structured environment, even though all the talk about ambiguity, right? You have clearly defined ranks, roles, responsibilities, chain of command, how information flows, where information can and can't go. The corporate environment is a bit similar, but I would argue, at least in my personal experience, it's not as rigid as time, or as rigid as you would think. Sometimes those people processes aren't there. Now, you as in the C-suite, or maybe just any managerial leadership role, all the way from the top to the bottom, you need certain information to do your job. I would argue, of course, it's top-down driven, but the people, procedures, policies that allow that flow of information efficiently in the format you want, that allow you to make actual insights, need to be done. So making those processes, whether it's, the generic, hey, we have daily stand-ups, we have weekly meetings, we have, so to say, objectives from the top. Hey, these are our core goals. That's important. And framing that and making sure kind of everyone is aware of the goal, working towards all the way from the top down to the bottom is important. Now, recently, we've kind of implemented different kind of knowledge bases so everyone is allowed to have input, and these all feed a core database. Not to plug too many tools, but we started using something called Obsidian, which essentially allows all users from the top all the way to the bottom to input their daily reports, weekly reports, what they did, why they're doing this, questions they have, all into a consolidated, so to say, database, such that any LLM, any person can see what the other is doing, not to be micromanagerial, but to truly understand what are the blockers. And to be LLM assisted by that has been a game changer.
Let me turn to the concept of financial literacy as a compliance strategy. And why do you believe that organizations can become stronger when financial information is not simply available, but understandable across the various corporate departments?
At its whole, right? It's, financial literacy, right? Defined as, anything from just your personal finance to organization. It's an overall just good thing to have. And it's not just a organizational ethics issue. Is something that really should be imbued into everybody. It's essentially our risk management for like non-financial people. So let's do the counterexample, right? In a portfolio or a fund, right? If everyone's not sharing the same financial literacy or, so to say, understanding of, why are we doing this, right? Why are we making these decisions at the top, or why are these decisions at the bottom? Not how are they translating to what we do? There still needs to be that flow down and flow up. So, I don't want to dive too deep into, the minutia, but essentially, people comply better when they understand the why, right? Financial literacy in this context of a fund means, hey, do you understand what we're doing, why, the compliance, the rules, the processes, procedures? If you get the end goal, then you just have a team of people working towards that. And it's a lot better run organization, in my opinion.
Justin, what excites you the most about the future of compliance, finance, and technology?
Compliance, finance, and technology. It might go back, and just maybe I'm biased from this discussion, but it might go back to that algorithmic auditing point, right? Because I had a little more time to think about it too. Those topics are all melded, right? Finance, compliance, innovation, but in a sense, right? When you're bringing the compliance aspect into finance, I'm relatively newer at this, but traditionally the cop-out answer, which I still used here, was seek legal counsel, seek legal advice, and you still should. But, especially with this algorithmic auditing and just understanding, you're able to make a lot more informed decisions. If you're able to you have clear guidelines. when we step back. We talked about the FAR, but of course there's FINRA and SEC rules and regulations that are clearly outlined, public for everyone to see. It's a lot, but you can set, to a certain extent, goals, metrics, limits, etc., based on those rules, and apply them to your fund, investment firm, business, etc., such that, are you exceeding this? Are you not? Are you complying with this? To the best of your knowledge, you can do an own internal audit and kind of getting that up to speed. Hey, maybe you can write your like private placement memorandum a little bit better based on the new updated rules, or at least have an idea of what's going on. And that field might expand greatly, right? Compliance, especially in financial systems with algorithmic auditing, or just overall understanding, might be huge. I don't know the timeline when, but we shall see.
Well, Justin, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out anything more about your company or your podcast, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Understood. Thank you. So, for anyone who wants to reach out, I'm also available on LinkedIn at Justin Rupnine. If you want to learn more about the podcast, we're on all the socials at Approaching Infinity or at Approaching Infinity Podcast. And then lastly, if you're interested in learning more about the fund itself, not a solicitation, but limitlesslp.com. Thank you.
Justin, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Agreed. Thank you very much.